let's do a couple of things. Let's remind ourselves, please, to use the VLE. Remember, we are now into B5. So that's the first topic of paper 2, as they used to call it. Got 3 topics to do. I know we had 4 topics for paper 1. These 3 topics, they're quite big actually, so that it's not smaller. This it's about the same size as the first 4. Remember, on the VLE, it's called homeostasis, this unit, and there's 3 packs to it. The first one we're going to start now is about homeostasis and the nervous system. So neurons, how neurons control reflexes. The next pack will be about hormones, and those are chemical signals that travel in the blood, but they're also involved in homeostasis. Now, pack 14 is also about hormones, but it's about hormones that control human reproduction. Okay, so go into pack 12 resources. Remember that the pack's going to be there, but I'm going to show you that in a moment. But also set up the pack 12 caboodle quiz. Remember, the slides we're using now are here, and revision videos here as well, and also the textbook and revision guide for you to use to help you do some of these questions. Right, homeostasis. What is it exactly? Well, homeostasis, it's about keeping your internal environment the same. Things like the temperature inside your body, it's always kept the same, even though the temperature outside changes. That's homeostasis. Homeo means the same. Stasis means state. Keeping inside your body in the same state. Now, the way it does that is by using something called automatic control systems. We'll see what they are during this lesson. We're also going to have a look at the structure of sensory neurons and reflex neurons and motor neurons. And we're going to look at a simple circuit of 3 neurons. Just one sensory, one reflex, one motor. It can form something called a reflex arc. And it's one of the simplest ways that we can control behavior. Remember, on our blue slides, that's our page 2. So be really careful to study this. That first point there, it explains homeostasis is the regulation of internal conditions of a cell or an organism to maintain optimal conditions for its function in response to internal and external changes. Wow, that is a long and complicated way to say homeostasis is how we keep our internal conditions the same. Why do homeostasis? Well, look at point 2. And remember, we've got to think, how can they ask us about these lines on page 2 in our exam? And I'm thinking the question could be, what is the purpose of homeostasis? Well, I know homeostasis is about keeping things the same, but why do we need to keep things the same? Keep them the same to maintain optimal conditions for enzyme action and cell functions. That's a good sentence, that. That's the reason we use homeostasis, so that we've got good conditions for enzymes and cell functions. And part 3 gives us 3 good examples of homeostasis: keeping blood glucose the same, keeping body temperature the same, keeping levels of water inside your body the same. How do we do it? We use automatic control systems. Let's look at what one of those is like. Here's a little example of an automatic control system. Now, we're going to start over here. Imagine a bright light. We're going to call this the stimulus. And it's a change in the environment. That's what a stimulus is. A change in the environment, okay? Bright light. Now, stimulus could be anything. It could be taste molecules, it could be smell molecules, it could be heat, it could be sound, anything that our bodies can detect. Now, a bright light is detected by a receptor organ in our eyes. So receptors detect stimuli. Yeah, and bright light's not good really for your eyes. So a receptor detects the stimulus, really bright, sends a little message. It sends a message to a thing, hang on. Let's get rid of that. It sends a message to a thing we call the coordinator. Often the coordinator is a little nerve cell called a relay neuron, or could be something else like a pancreas if we're talking about controlling glucose, but most of the time the coordinator is a relay neuron. A coordinator makes decisions about what to do. So the coordinator will send a signal to something called an effector. And an effector is something that causes a response. And it's usually a muscle. And in this picture, we're talking about muscles in the iris of the eye, because they change the size of the pupil. Remember, the pupil is the hole in the eye. And if someone shines a bright light into your eye, well, the receptor in the eye will detect it. It will send a message to a coordinator. The coordinator decides to send a message to the muscles in the eye to make them cause the pupil to get smaller. And the pupil getting smaller is called the response. Okay, do you see that? So this whole thing is known as an automatic control system. It's the way we carry out homeostasis. This is an example of homeostasis because a really bright light has been shined into the eye. It's been detected by the receptor, I don't want too much light in the eye. I want to control how much light goes into the eye. So the receptor sends a message to the coordinator. This is a relay neuron that makes a decision, sends a message to the effector. And the effector in an automatic control system is usually a muscle, but it can also be a gland. And this effector in this example has caused the pupil to get smaller. We've got some circular muscles here that contract and pull together and make the pupil go smaller. And that pupil going smaller is the response. So the effectors cause the response. So it's a really important idea in this pack. It's the automatic control system. The stimulus detected by the receptor that sends a message to the coordinator that decides what to do. The coordinator sends a message to the effector, usually a muscle, and the muscle causes the response. The pupil gets smaller and I get a normal level of light back in my eye to avoid damage. So this next slide is just the same. It's just recapping those elements of an automatic control system. Now, in this example, we've got an automatic control system that involves the nervous system. And that's because this pack is about the nervous system. The next pack, we could have an automatic control system using hormones. But when we use nerves for an automatic control system, then I can include these bits here. A stimulus is detected by a receptor. Information from the receptor is sent down a sensory neuron. A sensory neuron carries message from a receptor. A receptor senses things, doesn't it? The sensory neuron sends a message to the coordinator. The coordinator is usually in the brain or the spine, if we're talking about nervous system. The coordinator uses a motor neuron to send a message to the effector. And the effector is usually a muscle, but it can be a gland, sending out a hormone. And the effector causes a response. That's what it is. Stimulus goes to receptor. And if it's a nervous system thing, it's a sensory neuron, coordinator, motor neuron, effector. If I wanted to be really simple, I'd just say this. Automatic control system starts with a stimulus, then receptor, coordinator, effector, response. Okay, good. So let's now think a little bit about the nervous system. Remember that what I was talking about, automatic control systems. It's not just the nervous system. It's also can be carried out by hormones. But we're focusing on the nervous system in this pack. The blue slide is from page 2's. So we need to know a bit about the structure of the nervous system. Remember, of course, nervous system carries messages in the form of electrical impulses. Electrical impulses. So it's back to our shared screen, by the way. Electrical impulses. Now, there's two parts of the nervous system really. We've got the central nervous system, and that is the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain. It's got nervous tissue all the way down in the middle of your backbone. And that's the central nervous system. All the neurons that are inside your brain or inside the spinal cord. Of course, not all nerves are inside the spinal cord or brain. There's tons shown like this on the right. Tons of neurons that are outside the spinal cord and the brain. And these form something called the peripheral nervous system. And actually there's two types of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. They're the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Now let's look at this. It's a nice simple diagram of a sensory neuron. I know it's a sensory neuron because the cell body, and that's this area with the nucleus in the middle, it's kind of sticking off to the side of this long piece of neuron called the axon. That's what a sensory neuron looks like, with the cell body that includes the nucleus sticking out on a little arm from the axon. Now, at the beginning of every neuron, we have little branches called dendrites. Dendrites are at the beginning of a neuron. What I mean by beginning is it's the part of the neuron where the electrical impulse begins. The electrical impulse in a neuron only moves in one direction. From the beginning, near the dendrites, down the axon, to the nerve endings. Now the nerve endings look like dendrites. They look like small branches. But they're not dendrites, they're nerve endings, because that's where the nervous impulse ends up. So a sensory neuron carries that electrical impulse from a receptor. A receptor organ like an eye or the skin, there's receptors that detect heat on. Or the tongue, there's receptors that detect taste. Or the nose, there's receptors that detect smell. Receptors send information down sensory neurons towards the central nervous system. And that's where we're going to have our little coordinators. And notice here that long stretched out piece of cell is filled with cytoplasm. It's called the axon. And it's a very special adaptation for neurons, because it means a neuron can be very, very long cell. They're the longest cells in the body. You could have a neuron going all the way from your big toe to your spinal cord. That's absolutely huge cell. Now, the axon is surrounded by some special fatty cells which make a layer of insulation. We call that layer of insulation the myelin sheath. And it insulates axons and speeds up impulses. Now in the next slide we're looking at a motor neuron. It's a different type of neuron. It looks different. Remember that our sensory neuron had the cell body with its nucleus sticking off to the side of the axon. The motor neuron has the cell body with the nucleus near the beginning of the neuron. The little dendrites feed straight in to the cell body, and the axon extends out of the cell body. So they're easily recognizable, the motor neurons. They have the cell body at the beginning. Remember, dendrites, they're the little branches. They're at the beginning of the neuron. I know it's the beginning of this neuron because the impulse is moving from left to right. The impulse only goes in one direction, from the start of the neuron to the end of the neuron, where our nerve endings are, the little branches. Motor neurons connect from the central nervous system. They connect from the coordinator. The coordinator is usually a little neuron called a relay neuron, and they carry the electrical signal all the way to an effector. An effector here I've shown is a muscle. Can be a gland, but it's often a muscle. Look again on this neuron. We've got the myelin sheath wrapped around the axon to insulate and help speed up the electrical impulse. Okay, on the next slide we'll see a little summary. I've got the sensory neuron at the top. In the middle, we haven't seen this yet, but we've got a relay neuron. Remember, a relay neuron is in the central nervous system. A relay neuron is in the brain or the spine. A relay neuron looks different to the other neurons because its cell body with the nucleus is kind of in the middle of the axon. The axon actually kind of moves through it. That's different to the sensory neuron, because the sensory neuron has its cell body and its nucleus off on a little branch from the axon. The motor neuron has got the cell body and the nucleus before the axon. And this slide, it just summarizes that little automatic control system we mentioned before. We start with a receptor organ like an eye or the skin. Sends a message using a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Inside the central nervous system, the message is taken up by the relay neuron. The relay neuron passes the message to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron passes the message to an effector, usually a muscle. Right, let's go on slightly more. The thing I want to mention is something called a reflex arc. A reflex arc. Now, a reflex arc, all it is a little electrical circuit. It's made up of a receptor and a sensory neuron and a relay neuron and a motor neuron. and it helps humans respond very quickly to stimuli that could be damaging. Reflexes, they're important for survival. They might help animals or any kind of organism escape danger. They may help any organism find food. And I think you can see reflexes much better in newborn babies. They have a whole range of reflexes, like if you touch the palm of their hand, they will grab the hand. And that makes sense because it means they'll be grabbing onto their mum probably, who will look after them. There's also pupil reflexes, like the one we saw at the beginning, where if a bright light is shone into an eye, the pupil automatically becomes smaller to protect the eye. So we can think of a reflex. Another example could be if someone was holding a plate with gloves and they passed it to you and it was way too hot. Your reflex would be to drop the plate. That's a reflex. You're not thinking about it. So your body is preventing damage. There's no conscious control. That would actually take longer. It would mean electrical messages were going to your brain and going to this cell and that cell. That's too long. The reflex helps us respond very quickly and protects our body from damage. Reflexes are so quick. Why? Well, they only involve 3 neurons. The sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and the motor neuron. So let's have a look at an example. Here's a reflex arc. Remember, it's an automatic response. There's no conscious thought. We don't have any electrical impulses going to the brain where the consciousness is controlled. So here's our example. We start with a stimulus, a sharp pin. That's detected by receptors in the skin. Now the receptors send a message down this blue sensory neuron all the way down the arm and to the spine. This bit on the right hand side of the slide is the spine. These lines represent the bones of the backbone, and this slightly grey shaded area is the spinal cord, just like it's been sliced across. So the impulse down the sensory neuron carries the message to the spinal cord, to the central nervous system. There it passes the message across a synapse. So the electrical message doesn't go directly into the relay neuron. It's passed over using a synapse. It's actually a little gap where the electrical message is very briefly converted into a chemical message. Now the relay neuron, remember, that is a coordinator. That transfers the message onto a motor neuron. Again, there's another synapse here. The synapse is converting the little electrical message briefly into a chemical message. And then a new electrical message starts again in the green motor neuron. Carries us all the way back to an effector, a little muscle in your fingers or maybe in your arms, and that will cause a response, and you'll pull your finger away from the sharp pin. So that's just an example of a reflex arc. Remember, it's very quick because it's automatic and has no conscious thoughts. So we don't have any other neurons carrying a message into your brain and letting you think about it. Say, oh, this is a bit sharp. Shall I move my arm away or not? Shall I leave it there? That would take too long. That's why a reflex arc is quick. It's automatic. That means it doesn't involve the conscious parts of the brain. It's just 3 neurons, a sensory neuron, a relay neuron in the spine, and a motor neuron, bringing the message back to the effector.